Boa noite a todos. Nós estamos agora abrindo a 11ª sessão ordinária relativa ao 195º ano acadêmico. E gostaríamos de colocar em discussão e aprovação a ata de 16 de maio de 2024. Alguém tem alguma observação a fazer? Algum acadêmico tem alguma observação a fazer a respeito da ata de 16 de maio? Então, podemos considerar aprovada. Passo agora a palavra aos ilustríssimos acadêmicos para fazerem os seus comentários antes de começarmos a sessão. Ninguém quer falar? Meu Deus. O nosso secretário-geral, Omar Lupe da Rosa Santos, gostaria de falar.
Senhora presidente, senhores acadêmicos, prezados convidados, é com grande satisfação que nós parabenizamos nosso confrade Medina, porque no seu hospital, sob sua coordenação, essa semana se realizou o número simbólico de 20 mil transplantes renais, e essa é a maior experiência mundial nos últimos 25 anos, em qualquer lugar do mundo, portanto, mundial. Então, acho que o nosso confrade, que não está aqui hoje, merece que seja lembrado em plenário esse feito, e uma salva de palmas eu acho que caberia bem para ele também.
Alguma coisa a mais? Bom, caso não haja nenhuma outra comunicação, eu gostaria de chamar à mesa os organizadores do simpósio, o acadêmico Jorge Rezende e o doutor Antônio Braga. Por favor. Aí, pode assumir, Jorge.
Senhora presidente, senhores acadêmicos, boa noite. Nós vamos agora à parte principal da nossa sessão e vamos começar dando a palavra ao professor Antônio Braga, que vai nos contar um pouco da história da doença trofoblástica do Brasil.
Excelentíssima senhora presidente da Academia Nacional de Medicina, professora Eliette Busquelar, excelentíssimo senhor secretário-geral da Academia Nacional de Medicina, professor Dr. Omar Lupe da Rosa Santos, excelentíssimo senhor acadêmico, professor Jorge de Rezende Filho, meu mentor, meu chefe, meu amigo querido, na figura de quem saúdo todos os excelentíssimos senhores acadêmicos aqui presentes, amigos queridos da Associação Brasileira de Doença Trofoblástica Estacional, minhas senhoras e meus senhores, é com enorme prazer que eu venho a essa tribuna desse excelso sodalício para, nesse momento, trazer um pouco da história da doença trofoblástica estacional no Brasil, no bojo desse 21º Congresso Brasileiro de Doença Trofoblástica Estacional. Apresentação essa, a qual eu não tenho conflito de interesse. Como presidente emérito da Sociedade Brasileira de História da Medicina, tenho a plena convicção, tal qual Goethe, que aquele que não sabe a história de sua arte, nada dela conhece. É a história da doença trofoblástica gestacional no Brasil, registrada em seus primórdios no primeiro hospital organizado nesse estado, que foi a Santa Casa da Misericórdia do Rio de Janeiro, fundada em 1582. Naquele serviço estelar, em 1959, foi fundada a 33ª Enfermaria, Maternidade da Santa Casa. Seus destinos foram entregues ao professor Jorge de Rezende, pai, que organizou um serviço obstétrico modelar que irradiou cultura obstétrica para todo o nosso país. Eis que, fruto do serviço de excelência que ali existia, em 1960 foi admitida a primeira paciente naquele serviço com doença trofoblástica gestacional. Sendo, portanto, 1960 o início da doença trofoblástica gestacional como moléstia acompanhada de forma sistemática num serviço hospitalar brasileiro. Isso se configura, e por sem dúvida, como o serviço de doença trofoblástica gestacional mais antigo do mundo em atividade ininterrupta, aqui no nosso país, na nossa cidade do Rio de Janeiro. Por certo, a experiência da primeira década foi acanhada, mas permitiu acumular-se o saber daquilo que foi bem feito para se plasmar o conhecimento que nós temos hoje sobre essa moléstia invulgar, esse trofoblastoma que tumultua as gravidezes de nossas mulheres. Aqui, para vocês verem apenas a descrição do que foi a primeira cirurgia de retirada da mole datiforme, escritas pelos colegas da época, e chama a atenção a anestesia feita pela irmã Maria Tereza, que era quem fazia as anestesias na nossa maternidade, aqueles idos. A criação de um ambulatório especializado no bojo da 33ª Enfermaria coube a seu líder, o timoneiro daquele serviço, acadêmico, professor doutor Jorge de Rezende, que nos deixou em 2006 e que deu dignidade à nossa especialidade. De tudo, ensinou a todos, e foi ele o grande responsável por iluminar a 33ª Enfermaria. De modo específico, os destinos da doença trofoblástica gestacional na maternidade da Santa Casa foi delineado de forma primorosa pelo meu grande mestre, professor Paulo Belfort, que nos deixou em 2012, e sua pleiade de assistentes, dentre os quais eu saliento aquele que estabeleceu as bases da anatomia patológica nessa doença, o muito querido professor acadêmico, Dr. José Maria Barcelos, também falecido em 1998. O professor Barcelos, que estudou mais de 100.000 placentas, conseguiu arregimentar o mais primoroso acervo histopatológico de doença trofoblástica gestacional do mundo, na nossa maternidade da Santa Casa. Curioso que, ainda em 1961, as dosagens de gonotrofina coriônica, essenciais para o segmento da mola, já eram feitas no Rio de Janeiro, e aqui elas eram feitas na UFRJ, e aqueles idos não tinham ainda um radioimunisciência enzimática. Os testes de HCG eram testes biológicos, utilizavam sapos bufos marinos através da reação de Guyliman-Nini, para, analisando-se a espermatorreia dos sapos, avaliava-se o nível de HCG. Aqui apenas para mostrar um pedido de HCG da época, solicitado pelo professor Simão Kozlovski, ainda em 1960, e essa dosagem hormonal era feita no nosso Instituto de Ginecologia da UFRJ, chefiado pelo acadêmico professor Dr. Arnaldo de Moraes, que nos deixou em 1961. Foi o professor Arnaldo de Moraes que trouxe para o Brasil, em 1955, e especialmente a essa Academia Nacional de Medicina, aquele que desenvolveu os primeiros testes para diagnóstico do HCG, que à época era chamado de Prolan, a eliminação na urina das grávidas de prolanúria, que foi Zondek junto com Eschen. Então, essa matéria do Jornal do Comércio de 1955 mostra a visita do professor Zondek nesse templo da medicina brasileira, que é a Academia Nacional de Medicina, Sodalício de Soares de Meireles. Com o desenvolvimento das técnicas de ensaios biológicos, assumiu a realização dos testes de HCG o acadêmico professor Gerson Cota Pereira, que fazia gratuitamente os testes de HCG para as nossas pacientes da maternidade da Santa Casa, e nos deixa muito saudade pelo seu passamento em 2010. O primeiro livro de neoplasia trofoblástica estacional do Brasil foi, e não podia ser de forma diferente, escrito pelo professor Rezende Pai, Paulo Belfort e pelo acadêmico professor José Maria Barcelos. Com o avançar do conhecimento, era importante salientar que até 1956, todas as pacientes que tinham a evolução para o câncer da placenta eram sistematicamente tratadas com cirurgia. Era a esterectomia a modalidade de tratar a neoplasia trofoblástica estacional. Até que dois pesquisadores do National Cancer Institute, o professor Min-Chu Lee e o Dr. Roy Hutt, em 1956, descobriram o primeiro quimioterápico para tumores sólidos da medicina, que eles chamaram à época de ametopterina, e que hoje nós conhecemos como Metrexate. Quando eles publicaram esse ensaio, houve um prefácio enigmático: God made the cancer and man makes the cure. Deus fez o câncer e o homem fazia a cura, e isso é verdade há mais de meia centúria para o tratamento desses corioblastomas. Interessante dizer que durante tantas décadas, quem fazia as infusões de quimioterapia era a irmã Filomena. Não tínhamos ainda capela de fluxo, pode parecer estranho, mas eu fiz muita quimioterapia sem capela de fluxo. Eu preparava as infusões de Metrexate. O professor Jorge via isso acontecer, o professor Mauricio via isso acontecer na nossa enfermaria, e nós tratávamos e curávamos milhares de mulheres que acorriam para os corredores da nossa Santa Casa. Para alguns casos, o metotrexate não funcionava, e coube ao professor acadêmico Kenneth Bagshaw, titular da Royal Society of Medicine, que nos deixou em 2022, estabelecer as bases dos tratamentos poliquimioterápicos para curar mulheres que o metotrexate não mais curava. O Brasil tornou-se centro das atenções da doença trofoblástica estacional no ano de 1986, quando aqui sediou o 3º Congresso Mundial de Doença Trofoblástica Estacional, que se deu no Sheraton. Nessa mesa de abertura desse congresso, em 1986, está aqui presente entre nós o professor Rosberkowitz, aqui mostrado, que terá fala no final dessa noite. Temos aqui o professor Kenneth Bagshaw, o professor Paulo Belfort, aqui o acadêmico, o professor Dr. Irã Silveira Lux, que tratava as nossas pacientes com poliquimioterapia no hospital Mário Kreff, que nos deixou já de saudosa memória em 2020, e aqui o nosso querido professor Dr. Ivan Lengruber, que sempre nos socorreu nos casos ginecológicos, ele também falecido em 2006. Na sessão de inauguração desse Congresso Mundial, essa era a plateia. Aqui os senhores podem ver o acadêmico, o professor doutor Eudoberto Carneiro, que nos deixou por ocasião da pandemia de Covid que vivemos em 2020, mas chama a atenção aqui o doutor Salvador Pai e o Henrique Salvador, ainda menino, e aqui hoje sentado entre nós, me dá muita alegria de ver a perpetuação dos colegas aqui. Doutor Mauricio Viggiano também entre nós aqui, numa plateia de saudosa memória, com alegria de ter muitos dos colegas entre nós. A minha chegada na doença trofoblástica gestacional, ela é noviça. Aconteceu no ano de 1999, quando me aninhei à 33ª Enfermaria. Ali pude privar do que há de melhor na especialidade, aprender com os grandes mestres da obstetrícia em geral e da doença trofoblástica gestacional em particular. Conhecer grandes nomes da medicina que estiveram ligados à doença trofoblástica, como o professor Fauser Simão Abrão, do Hospital Secamar, que foi o introdutor das poliquimioterapias no nosso país. Uma mudança invulgar na história natural dessa doença deu-se com os préstimos da ultrassonografia. Esse método propedêutico biofísico, hoje, rotina no pré-natal, mudou a história dessas mulheres, permitindo o diagnóstico precoce. Hoje, metade das pacientes não chegam assintomáticas, mas não apenas faz o diagnóstico precoce, como permite antever as invasões miometriais com os préstimos da Doppler fluxometria. Os primeiros a descrever as imagens de invasão miometrial no mundo, na década de 80, foi o professor Yazaki, do Japão, e o professor Mauricio Guilherme Campos Viggiano, de Goiânia, aqui presente. Os estudos da biofísica na doença trofoblástica gestacional foram aprimorados com os estudos do professor acadêmico Carlos Antônio Barbosa Montenegro, que fez um trabalho importante sobre o uso do Doppler na predição de neoplasia trofoblástica gestacional, à época, com o seu mais dileto discípulo, hoje acadêmico, professor Jorge Rezende, Filho, que tem a cátedra da cadeira que pertenceu a Fernando Magalhães. Fato é, minhas senhoras e meus senhores, que a família trofoblástica brasileira teve nos seus membros fundadores os homens aí mostrados. Professor Mauricio Guilherme Campos Viggiano, professor Chagas Oliveira, professor José Mauro Madi, que não está entre nós nesse momento, porque está em Caxias do Sul e teve dificuldades para vir em virtude das enchentes que acometeu o nosso povo sul-rio-grandense, o professor Paulo Belfort, o professor Fauser Simão Abrão e o professor José Maria Barcelos. Ainda menino, fui recebido em Berbe, nos braços da Santa Casa da Misericórdia do Rio de Janeiro, onde pude aprender a especialidade com os meus mestres, professor Jorge Rezende Pai e professor Paulo Belfort. Quis aventura que outros caminhos pudessem se abrir para mim, ainda noviço, tendo tido a oportunidade de fazer o meu pós-doutorado na Harvard Medical School, onde privei do contato com o professor Donald Goldstein e o professor Horst Berkowitz, professor Berkowitz aqui entre nós, em 2010, também no Imperial College of London, no Charing Cross Hospital, onde fui também recebido pelo professor Michael Sepa, então presidente da Sociedade Internacional de Doença Trofoblástica Gestacional. Voltando desse segundo pós-doutorado agora em Londres, nós fizemos no Brasil o 3º Congresso Sul-Americano de Doença Trofoblástica Gestacional. E por que isso foi importante? Tinha no Brasil, naquele ano de 2013, apenas 12 centros de referência. Hoje nós somos 44 centros de referência, fruto do trabalho de mulheres e homens, de jovens e longevos, irmanados no estudo da doença trofoblástica gestacional. Caminhando para o final da minha apresentação, eu lhes apresento o único estudo da minha fala. Doutorado da minha amiga, professora Fernanda Freitas, aqui entre nós, encontrou que a única variável modificável que evita que mulheres jovens morram por essa doença é o fato delas serem acompanhadas em centros de referência, de modo que é uma política pública acompanhar essas mulheres nos 44 serviços especializados no Brasil, ao menos um em cada estado da nossa federação, fazendo com que essa família trofoblástica linda, composta por tantas pessoas potentes, que sonham juntos a possibilidade de cuidar dessas mulheres tão frágeis e restituir-lhes a saúde, mantendo-lhes a capacidade reprodutiva, ajudando-lhes nas gestações subsequentes e, acima de tudo, garantindo conforto para recuperar-se dessa moléstia tão invulgar. termino falando sobre o que acontecerá em 2026. 40 anos após, o Rio de Janeiro será, mais uma vez, a sede de um congresso mundial de doença trofoblástica gestacional, lembrando os 40 anos da trajetória dessa doença no Brasil, os nossos mestres, as nossas memórias, os nossos afetos, as nossas lutas e as nossas conquistas em prol da saúde de todas as mulheres brasileiras com doença trofoblástica gestacional. Muito obrigado pela atenção das senhoras e dos senhores.
Obrigado, professor Braga, que nos brindou com uma linda revisita à história dessa doença e da assistência no Brasil. Convidaria agora o professor Michael Seckel, da Academy of Medical Sciences, United Kingdom, e Imperial College of London, que vai nos falar sobre as perspectivas da doença trofoblástica gestacional no mundo.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back talking to you again. I'm going to try not to fall asleep. So if I look like I'm nodding off, please get your cattle prod out and wake me up. So, okay, let me move this out of my way. I don't really need to see that. So GTD successes over the last 70 years. Centralization of care has been key to that success. Low-risk disease, survival before we had any effective treatments was 0, and with effective treatments, you can now look to almost 100% survival. In fact, I haven't lost a single low-risk patient in the last 25, 30 years of practice. High-risk disease, again, it was 0. It's now up to 98% survival plus. PSTT and ETT, the good prognosis group, moved from 0 to 98% survival, and the poor prognosis group has gone from 0 to about 75% survival. So clearly, things have got a lot better over the last 70 years. And international standardization and the development of new centers is heralding, I think, a great future. And as I said earlier to you today, what you have achieved in Brazil is truly extraordinary. So, there are still global disparities. And when considering this, you should think about the under versus the developed economies. And so parts of Africa really have almost no money to spend on healthcare. Whereas we're terribly privileged in the UK and in the US and Europe and indeed in many countries where we have much more money to spend on healthcare. There are also social and ethnic effects on how patients access healthcare. So those from poor socioeconomic backgrounds will find it harder to access care because they can't, for example, pay for transport, or they're ignorant of the care that's available for them. And those from certain ethnic backgrounds may find that there are religious reasons why they might be prevented from accessing healthcare, for example, or there will be community pressure to go and visit the local witch doctor if you're in Africa, rather than go to a conventional doctor. Most countries, sadly, still lack centralization, including very modern countries like Germany and even the United States of America. Most countries lack expert pathology or an expert HCG assay, or even an expert clinical team. And these things are absolutely essential to achieve the wonderful results that can be reached in this group of disorders. And of course, there are many other global disparities that I'm sure you'll be able to think of. Over the world population is currently estimated to be just over 8 billion. So that means that probably at least 220,000 new GTD cases per year as an estimate. So probably about 22,000 new GTN cases per year. So if you assume that 75% of the world does not have access to centralized care, that's about 16,500 GTN women who do not have access to centralized care. And if you assume that if you have centralized care, your overall survival is going to be in excess of 99.5% for GTN, versus if you don't have access, it's about 85%, and these are assumptions, then the absolute deaths where you have centralized care will be about 30 patients per year, whereas where you don't have the centralized care, it's about 2,500 unnecessary deaths each year. So you may think, well, that's not very many women, but these are all young patients with their lives in front of them, and could be a potential great benefit to the communities that they live in. So what are the barriers to centralized care? Well, there may be political barriers, central from the government, or local from local government, or local healthcare providers. Healthcare professionals themselves may feel that they're more than capable of treating most GTN cases, and why should they send their case to a center when they can get on and treat the patient themselves? There may be financial perceptions about the fact that it's much more expensive to have a centralized healthcare system for these patients, or that you're losing money by sending a patient to a centralized area for management, as opposed to keeping them in your own hospital and therefore keeping the money for that particular hospital. There could be geographical barriers, and in fact, there was a very nice publication from the Brazilian team showing exactly what that means in terms of outcomes for patients. So if you've got a long way to travel, you don't have a center nearby, you don't do so well as if you've got a center nearby, or you don't have to travel too far. And as we were mentioning earlier, there can be all sorts of socio-economic barriers to making centralized care work. And I'm sure, again, you can think of many other barriers to the effective centralization of care. So if you are going to set up centralized care, there are many different models. There isn't one model fits all. Some centers register the cases in their center, but then organize management locally. And an example of that is the Lyon Center in France, which is working very effectively. Some choose that all management should happen in the center and nothing should be done locally. And an example of that is what happens in the north of my own country in the Sheffield Center. And others will opt for a mixed model where you have centralization through registry, and then some of the care is run centrally, but a lot of the care is managed locally. And that's what we do in our center. As part of the centralization, it is key that you have an HCG assay that is consistently used for the patients. And we heard this morning about the problems of HCG assays, so it's really important that you've got an HCG assay that is fit for purpose. You need a pathologist who is experienced. We found in our own country, and others have seen and produced similar data, that if you rely on the local pathologist to make the diagnosis, 30% of the time they will be wrong. And of course, if you have the wrong diagnosis, you start the wrong treatment. And we now know that genetics is actually very important in a number of cases to ensure that you are treating a gestational tumor as opposed to a non-gestational tumor. So having access to a genetics service is very valuable, as is, of course, the whole expert clinical team. And I'm sure you can think of many other models of centralized care. So what are the minimum requirements for a GTD centre? And this is something that we were pondering over the last year and a half in our series of international meetings to try and agree these things. And we've so far come up with this consensus from these 4 societies with about 52 people all sitting together in a room or in a virtual room. So the centre should see at least 6 patients, at least being discussed in the context of a multidisciplinary team and managed by the centre each year. At least 1 member of the GTD centre should be a member of an international GTD society and regularly attend its meetings. The centre should have an expert experienced in giving single-agent methotrexate, actinomycin D, Emaco, and MREP, or the equivalent. The centre should have or easy access to an expert pathologist, an expert nurse with special interest in GTD, a radiology department with all of the necessary equipment, including equipment to do interventional radiology so that you can embolize bleeding uterus or bleeding into the liver and so on, and it should have an intensive care unit. And the centre should serve at least as a regional referral centre for GTD. So this is a start. I expect this to get revised in coming years, but this is currently the internationally agreed minimum requirements for a GTD centre. So we need to also ensure that we speak the same language, that we have the same definitions, and this is something we touched on this morning and also this afternoon in Kevin's talk. And we've come up with a series of definitions, and I'm not going to go through all of them now. This is just a few of them highlighting some of the things that were discussed, but this will all come in the forthcoming manuscript, which should be out later this year. So we had a series of committee leads represented here, and I'm very grateful for all of their support and indeed all of the 52 members of the committee that serve to help formulate these guidelines, which I hope will help unify practice around the world. But there's still a lot more to do. And in addition to supporting international care through establishing new centres, which I think will have the largest impact in improving global survival rates from this rare group of cancers, and supporting education and the consensus guidelines, there are some things that we can do to improve outcome, even in the most experienced centres. So I'd like to spend the rest of my talk just thinking about these things a little bit. So at the moment, we can't distinguish between a good mole and a bad mole that is going to go on and develop gestational trophoblastic neoplasia. Similarly, we can't work out whether an atypical placental site nodule is going to cause a problem with an ETT or PSTT or not. It would be fabulous if we could sort those things out. Our FIGO scoring system, which we all know and love, has its failings, and there should be room to improve that. And we also need to get away from our very toxic therapies. We've spoken today about the need to get away from high-dose chemotherapy using immunotherapy, but there's also a need to get away from the very toxic combination agent chemotherapies. And here's another big question. How can we preserve fertility? A young woman has had a hysterectomy, first ever pregnancy ends in an ETT. It's a disaster. She clearly would like to retain her fertility. We need to work out strategies to make that work, rather than just simply saying standard of care is hysterectomy. And a lot of the answers to these things are going to come through a better molecular understanding of gestational trophoblastic disease and through trials and international collaborations. So, good versus bad moles. So, when you've had your mole out, there's a period of time where you're waiting to find out, do I need chemotherapy or can I get on with my life? And you're having regular HCG measurements. Now, maybe the HCG will fall for a while and then start rising, or as in this case, largely remain plateaued. And all the while, poor woman is getting increasingly anxious about what's going to be, needs to be done. And of course, then treatment starts and continues and is effective where it's needed. So it would be fabulous if you could make that diagnosis at the time that the mole was removed and cut out all of this uncertainty with HCG monitoring. So we need a new diagnostic test at the time that the mole is removed. And some things have been tried. So some very nice work that came from Boston looked at BCL2 and the microRNA 181. And although this is promising, it's not sufficient to give us an accurate diagnostic test to make a decision on. Other things that we could be doing is looking at the methylation profiles, for example, in the tumor tissue. We could be looking at blood or the tissue in other ways. So it could be that we could take sections from patients, even just H&E, put them through an artificial intelligence interrogation using modern imaging, digital imaging technology, and come up with an algorithm that can separate out the good versus the bad moles. So more research needs to be done here. And the best way to do this is with all of us working together. So what about the scoring system? So we know that patients scoring 0 to 6 are low risk, patients greater than 6 are high risk, patients more than 12, so 13 and above, are ultra high risk. How good is this scoring system? Well, in the low risk group, it's misclassifying about 30%, a third of patients. And as the score rises, it becomes less effective. So when you score 5 and 6, you're less likely to respond to single agent methotrexate than if you score 0. So the 5 and 6s have obviously caused us more consternation. People have previously called this the middle risk group and argued that they ought to have combination agent chemotherapy. But that's clearly much more toxic. And is that really necessary when you have an overall survival rate of 100%, even if you start with single agent therapy? So previous ways to select out those patients that might do badly with single agent treatment and instead do better with combination agent chemotherapy included an HCG over 400,000, or if you had metastatic choriocarcinoma. We set up an international collaboration. This was driven, in fact, by the Brazilians. So Antônio Braga ran this project. And this pooled data on patients with 5, 6 scores between our London Centre, the Brazil Centre, and the Boston Centre. And this is the power of collaboration globally. So 351 FIGO score 5, 6 cases. So now we have a reasonable number of cases to do an analysis. And we found that 60% of these women actually go into remission with either 1 or 2 sequential single agents. But what about the 40% that required MCO? Could we have identified those from the outset? And it turns out that we were able to pick out 3 groups. One was a known group, so if you have chorio with metastases, then 13 out of those 18 patients who were in that group ended up needing chemo with MCO. So that's more than 70%. So you could argue that group could have just got on with MCO straight away. Second group, chorio with no metastases, or they were post-molar and did have metastases, and their HCG was over 150,000. Then 12 of those women needed MCO. So immediately those women could have started MCO. And if they were post-molar, this is the third group, with no metastases and an HCG of over 410,000, so rather close to the 400,000 we previously identified, then those women needed chemotherapy, 6 out of 7, so 86%. So that's great. So that means that we have identified 10% of those 40%. So that's a reasonable number who could have started EMICO straight away, but that still leaves 30% where we have got to find a way to identify them. And how are we going to do this? Well, can we further refine our low-risk stratification? Well, simply revising the FIGO score weighting is not going to work. And several papers have shown this in very large numbers, 4,000 or 5,000 patients. It is not going to work. So we need new tests. Maybe the Doppler ultrasound might be sufficient. Maybe epigenetic profiling or a microRNA signature, or maybe some artificial intelligence mechanism might help us to sort this out. And there's a prospective international study running, the Titanium trial, which may help in this regard. So, reducing toxicity from EMICO. Can we get rid of EMICO? So, for many years, people who become resistant to methotrexate, at least in the UK, we use an HCG cutoff to determine whether we're going to give actinomycin D or not. Many places in the world don't use this cutoff and will just simply go ahead and give actinomycin D, regardless of the HCG. This shows you the first piece of data where we were using an HCG cutoff of 100, and you can see that quite a few people ended up needing EMICO. When we increased the HCG cutoff to 300, we spared more people the need to go to EMICO. And similarly, when we raised the HCG to 1,000, we spared even more people the need for EMICO. And we then raised it to 3,000. And I can tell you that we analyzed this data internally last year. And once again, we're sparing more women from EMICO, which is great. But the problem is that as we raise the HCG cutoff, the success rate with actinomycin D as the second agent is falling. And so there will probably come a point where our actinomycin D success rate will be so low that you'll ask, was it really worth going into the second single agent? And probably you should just get on with combination agent chemotherapy. So we're currently running it with a cutoff of 10,000. Okay, are there other ways to avoid it? Well, you heard today about carboplatin, and that has not been encouraging. What about immunotherapy? Well, the avelumab study that we discussed earlier only has a 53% complete response rate in a small number of patients treated. So I don't vote that as particularly a most effective second-line strategy after failing methotrexate. The French have just completed an avelumab plus methotrexate as a frontline therapy, and they'll be presenting their results at the ISSTD. They hinted at the meeting I've just come from in Stockholm that the results are going to be practice changing. So I'm assuming this might mean that none of their patients relapsed after avelumab and methotrexate, but we'll see when we get to Lyon. And then there are some proposed studies, and this is one of them, the Avocado trial, which is planned basically to take people who are failing methotrexate and meant to therefore switch to EMICO because their HCG is above 10,000, which is our current cutoff. And they would then, instead of getting methotrexate, instead of getting EMICO, get actinomycin D plus pembrolizumab. And those people who are below 1,000 would switch in the usual way to actinomycin D, but if that fails, then pembrolizumab would be added. So that study is still looking for funding. We've passed our first hurdle, but there's a second hurdle to go through. And if that passes, we might be able to open this study next year. What about avoiding EMICO toxicity in high-risk disease? Well, could it be that our FIGO scoring system isn't so accurate, and maybe we could take a FIGO score 7 patient and offer them single-agent methotrexate and folinic acid or actinomycin D? I don't know the answer to that. We presented a bit of data to suggest that that might be a reasonable thing to do, but not a lot of data to underpin that. If your FIGO score greater than 6, well, rather than having Emico, why not give single agent plus immunotherapy? Or maybe some other combination, such as an antivascular agent and pembrolizumab, rather like the Chinese have done. So there are some issues to consider, the rapid tumor growth versus the speed of effective immunotherapy. Immunotherapy tends to be a bit slow to work, and if you've got a very fast-growing cancer, you might be overwhelmed by it. And there's a problem of, well, how much resistance and what will the relapse rates be? Do we really have a handle on this? And we're starting to get some sort of idea for this, for immunotherapy. And what about the unknown long-term toxicities of immunotherapy? Again, we're starting to get a handle on that. And then maybe there are other less toxic alternatives, the antibody-directed cytotoxic agents, for example, against TROP2, which is an antigen expressed on trophoblast. So many questions also remain for us to address with ETTs and PSTTs. Do they clinically behave similarly? Do they, for example, secrete the same amount of HCG? My clinical impression is that ETTs secrete less HCG, and actually they fistulate more. I've never seen a PSTT fistulate, but I have seen several ETTs fistulate. And are they more resistant than PSTTs to existing therapies? And what happens to these tumors at 4 years? Why after 4 years do they behave so badly? How do we enhance survival? Immunotherapy is looking really good and will replace high dose, but what about other novel agents and combinations? There's still room to improve. And we talked about the issue of preserving fertility with local versus systemic therapies. So how are we going to address these things? Such a rare cancer. Well, an international database is essential. And that is probably also true for ultra-high risk disease. And that brings me, I think, to the next question, which is trials versus databases globally. Well-designed trials are clearly the gold standard, but we have very small case numbers. It's hard to fund these studies either nationally and even harder internationally. And you need to retain flexibility in your design. Trials fix you into a way of treating the patient. And the trophimune avelumab story in the high-risk patients is a very telling story because they were very welded into what they were doing and couldn't adapt their trial, and it was a disaster for them. So databases, nationally versus international versus retro versus prospective, all true, but they're all only as good as the people entering data into them. And you only get a snapshot in time unless you can regularly go back and update the databases. And of course, quality control is important. People who are entering data into your database in China may not be giving you the same information as somebody entering data into your database from Brazil. And how do we ensure that the quality of what we call an apple in Brazil is the same apple in China? I'd like to now end on a good news story. So this is an example of a multi-center international collaboration. This patient was the first patient to be treated successfully with pembrolizumab in the world. You can see she had a very complicated disease course, ultra high risk, disease in the brain, in the liver, in the lungs, everywhere, low dose EP, goes through EPEMA, goes into remission, then relapses, then has more salvage chemotherapy and a tandem transplant, goes into remission, then relapses, escalated EP with a partial response, then progresses through GEM-TIP, and finally is saved with pembrolizumab. Was this just a one-off? Well, the only way to address this is by pooling information globally. And that's what we've done in this study. So you can see all the countries that have been contributing. And we've had 71 cases now treated with pembrolizumab, 34 in the UK, 37 non-UK. And of those patients who had measurable disease, and this is a mixture of chorios and placental site and epithelial or trophoblastic tumors, the complete response rate was 72%. So that's pretty impressive. And there were a number of patients who received the treatment adjuvantly. 15 of them were ETTs and PSTTs, poor prognosis, all of them, and all 15 of those women still remain in remission. 7 of them more than 3 years out. And there were two chorios who were poor prognosis who received adjuvant pembrolizumab, and one of 2 of those remains in remission. So clearly a very active regime. So how are we going to improve global outcomes? Ensuring global access and establishing new GTD centers is vital. Internationally agreed guidelines and definitions and education, education, education is so important. Eliminating the waiting room, I think, is a good thing to do for our patients globally, both for moles and for atypical placental site nodules. There are many ways that we might be able to do that. FIGO scoring needs improving, and we've discussed that. Reducing EMICO use is, I think, going to be important for patients both in the low and high risk setting. And I think my time is up, so I'm going to stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sacco. I would like to invite Professor Ross Berkowitz from Harvard Medical School and International Society for the Study of Trophoblastic Disease. Professor Sacco, have a seat here with us.
So thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for their warm reception and their friendship. And it's a delight to be back in Rio de Janeiro. It's been years. I hope not to have that happen again. The subject of our discussion today is a collaborative relationship between the troph centers in Brazil and New England Trophoblastic Disease Center. And we started working on this relationship in about 2012, and I have data up to, say, 2023. In terms of original reports and peer-reviewed journals, during this time interval, we had 50 publications, that's 50, and the quality of the journals that has been published in is quite good. In addition to the original reports, we have review articles and editorials as well, numbering 9. Now, how it all started out was that in the year 2012, we received a letter from Antônio Braga, and the letter went to Dr. Goldstein, Donald Biddle Goldstein, and myself, indicating he would like to visit our center and use it as an opportunity to do some clinical research. And he suggested the topic would be adolescence and complete mole. Well, we started doing that and other studies as well. And then we all met in Washington, D.C., or in one of the suburbs of Washington in 2014 at the Society of G1 Oncologists. We went out for dinner together and had some Southern American cooking, which I've actually never had before and probably won't again. At that meeting, we discussed several different ideas for projects. And we came to the conclusion, and Antonio was pretty strong in arguing for this, that the only way we're really going to do the type of work we want to do and the extent of the work we want to do is to meet every month, talk about what are the ideas we want to look at for studies, how do we design it, and as the data comes in, collect data, analyze, write manuscripts, get it out, and work on the next study. And this resulted in tremendous productivity. And I'd like to take this as an opportunity to indicate something that has grown from the relationship. I'm happy to say that Antonio Braga is being invited to be a visiting professor at Brigham and Women's Hospital, Harvard Medical School, New England Troph Center, and the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. And that will take place in September, and he will give grand rounds in the Department of OB/GYN, give a lectureship, the NAP lectureship MD, which is a nationally recognized lectureship, and participate in doing some of the research meetings on Troph disease while he's there. And we're looking very much forward to him joining us and hope that this will further strengthen more collaborations. So I'd like to review some of the papers that we've published in the past decade or so. And so the publications are like telling a story related to gestational trophoblastic disease. All the articles are authored with Brazilian authors and American authors. The first article I just want to present is a clinical article which was looking at the early diagnosis of complete mole and looking at the experience at the New England Trophoblastic Disease Center. And what we found, which was found in other studies and found at the New England Center in earlier studies, that the diagnosis of complete mole was becoming earlier and earlier and earlier, leading to tremendous decrease in the classical symptoms of the disease and a change in the pathology of the complete mole. The other finding was disappointing, and that was even if gestational age was left at less than 10 weeks as compared to gestational age at 10 to 22 weeks, this did not result in any decrease in the risk of GTN. And we were hopeful that with early recognition of complete mole, perhaps we could reduce the risk of developing GTN. But so far, we have not done that. Additionally, this was also looked at in the data in Brazil and looking at segments of time of 5 years where GTD and complete mole occurred in 15% and then 10%, so in complete mole. And the classic signs and symptoms definitely diminished and virtually, and some almost disappeared completely. But again, the incidence of persistent tumor requiring chemotherapy did not change at all. And we'll get back to this point toward the end of the talk. because it's, I think it's an area that has been alluded to by other speakers, and just Dr. Seckel alluded to, looking for pre-early diagnosis of the complete moles that we can anticipate that they're going to develop GCN. Not only have complete moles moved into the first trimester as the median time of diagnosis, also partial moles are now diagnosed earlier. However, partial moles, the risk of developing persistence is much lower, at most 1 to 4%, and even when it presented at more advanced stage, had less frequency of the early warning symptoms and signs. In terms of other risk factors for developing complete mole, this particular article looked at age, and the referent group was patients between the ages of 60 and 39. If the patient was less than 20 years, the increased risk in a conception that it would be complete mole was increased 7-fold. If the pregnancy occurred at 16 weeks or younger, the risk for complete mole was increased about 26-fold. If it was a pregnancy that occurred after 40, the risk was about 2-fold increase in complete mole. And if it was over 45, it increased to 15.3-fold. Now, this was only seen in complete molar pregnancy in this data set. However, in larger data sets, such as Turing cross-hospital data set, and in a setting where basically the data is population-based data, because all patients with molar disease are supposed to be recorded and followed in 3 centers and no more, that it is true that likely partial mole is also related to age. However, the strength of that relationship is likely substantially less than complete mole. Now, in terms of other risk factors for complete and partial mole, we looked at race and ethnicity. Now, as we indicated in the prior slides, that patients, when they're teenagers, if they get pregnant, they're at increased risk for complete mole. And in patients that are in socioeconomically groups in the United States and most other countries in the world, young women in their teens are more likely to have pregnancies if they are not wealthy or substantially supported socioeconomic groups. And in the United States, that occurs more in patients who are Black and Hispanic. Now, the referent group was 1, and using adjusted risk based on the age of the patient, Asian patients who consider themselves or describe themselves as Asian, they have a 2-fold increased risk for complete mole as compared to patients who are white. In terms of patients who are Hispanic, the risk for complete mole is significantly less than patients who are white. In patients who are Black, the risk is less, but does not reach statistical significance with a p-value of 0.07. Partial mole, interestingly, is different. And patients who are Asian, Black, or Hispanic, all of them are at lower risk of developing a partial mole than patients who are white. And this suggests that patients who are white have an increased incidence of dispermy or have an egg which is supposedly normal to the eye, but is fertilized by two spermatozoa. And the chromosomal pattern in essentially all partial moles is 69 chromosomes, or one extra set, where the extra set is always male in origin. This is something that's obviously we're hung up and very proud of the paper on FIGO 5 and 6, looking for single agent resistance, and to just emphasize certain things that I don't think was brought up in the other mentioning of this project, is that one striking important finding in the study is that we have 3 different hospitals using different HCG assays, and all 3 are different healthcare systems. Despite this, the finding of identifying risk factors for developing resistance to single agents with FIGO 5 and 6 could be done at all 3 sites. And that's a very hopeful sign as we think about broader communications in the future. Again, this is more of the slides for the class for 5 and 6 score, looking for the which factors could differentiate patients who got upfront or need upfront combination chemotherapy versus patients who don't need a combination chemotherapy and have a high remission rate with single agent. In this particular slide, I'm focusing on the bottom part. As been intimated by several speakers, there's certain pathologic patterns that tend to be more resistant to cytotoxic chemotherapy, and that's placental-site tumor and epithelioid trophoblastic tumor. Looking in this systematic study of looking at case studies and cases, there were 4 patients who had placental-site tumor, pure placental-site tumor, and 2 that had pure epithelioid trophoblast tumor. Strikingly, all of 6 patients were cured. Now, this is a small observation, but actually, the history of small observations in GTD, I think, has some relevance. The picture that was shown earlier of Lee and Hertz, and it could have had Spencer in it too, because it was Lee, Hertz, and Spencer, who published the first experience of methotrexate curing metastatic choriocarcinoma. And they treated 3 patients with metastatic chorio, where the expectation was none would survive, but all 3 survived. Similarly, the first article showing curability with Pembro from the Charing Cross Hospital, and I right now can't think of the specifics, but there's about 4 patients and 3 long-term remissions. So we, even in small studies with results that we're not expecting in this disease, that it could really represent a major finding And obviously, we still need to collect data, but it is hopeful that although PSTT and ETT is relatively more resistant to standard chemotherapy, that it appears that for immunotherapy with pembro, that is not the case. Now, actually, this is one of my favorite studies, and it's partly because I can't guess how many times people have said to me when I've given lectures on troph disease, well, if centers are so important, how come there's no article showing better survival? Which is a fair question. In this particular study, it looked at, in 10 centers in Brazil, over 2,000 patients with GTN. 89 of the patients died due to GTN. Using WHO scores to make sure that there is no lack of adjustment for any factors that may have explained the difference. The one factor that had the strongest risk for dying from lethality was the patient starting their chemotherapy outside of a troph center. And if they had high-risk disease and started their chemotherapy outside of a troph center, the relative risk of having a case that's lethal was 28-fold, which is incredibly striking. Now, although that's incredibly striking and is a good vote for the importance of reference centers, in the next study, we drilled down deeper to look at issues of patients getting their care completely without being lost to follow-up, and because they live at a greater distance away from their regional or local trophoblast center. And if they lived more than 56 kilometers away from the center, there was a statistical increase in the risk of metastases, need for multi-agent chemo, loss to follow-up, occurrence of chemoresistance, relapse, and death. Although this is a concerning finding, importantly, this could be dealt with by simple measures like providing the patients with free bus transportation and other things to facilitate their access to the reference center. And hopefully this can be done and will result in further improvements in survival. Because there's nothing biological about the issue of living 56 kilometers from the troph center. One of the most important concerns of patients is, can they have a normal baby in the future? Now, this has been looked at many times, and the articles have generally shown that, in general, the expectation for normal pregnancy is the same, except for an increased risk for complete and partial mole of a 1% to 2% risk. However, in this particular study that was a meta-analysis, that it showed if the patient got pregnant early after their HCG hits normal, and they didn't follow the advice of 1 year of normal follow-up, but got pregnant 6 months or before, this resulted in a greater risk of spontaneous abortion. So this is important for patients to be aware of. and importantly is another reason to encourage patients to complete their follow-up. Now, I want to get back to the question that I posed earlier, and that is the early diagnosis of molar pregnancy early in pregnancy in terms of gestational age seems to have no identifiable impact on the risk of developing cancer. What is going on? What's different about a complete mole that goes to spontaneous remission and complete mole that develops persistent disease? What are the potential differences? And is there something going on in DNA regulation in these tissues that was present right at their first clinical interaction with emptying the uterus? In this particular plot, on the right side of the slide is the patients who were benign complete moles and spontaneously went to remission. The pattern on the other side of the slide is not subtly different. The three genes that were, and in terms of microRNA, the three microRNAs in the patients that were most induced were, two of them were involved in apoptosis, which is not a surprise for potentially being related to having persistent disease. So microRNA profiles can be used to help identify which complete moles will go on to develop persistence. And then in a second study, to look at methylation of the DNA, which would suppress DNA from being expressed. And there were 22 patients with complete moles, 13 went to spontaneous remission, and 9 developed GTN. Now, and again, on the right side is benign. On the left side is patients who went to develop GTN or cancer. And again, it's not very subtle. There's pretty striking differences in the methylation patterns between the complete moles that develop persistence and complete moles that don't. The differences in persistence is not because we're just leaving molar tissue in the uterus in some patients, and in others, there are more complete evacuations. There's some sort of biologic predetermination that's occurring early on. So with that, I'd like to, again, thank you for the opportunity to present the data. And more importantly, not just to present the data, many people in this room were critical to getting these studies done. And thank you so much, because they are important studies that will help us to provide the best possible care to these patients. And we're not nearly done. We're just at the beginning. And I'd just like to take a few minutes, which I see I have on the clock, so I won't have to apologize too much, to look at the question, what makes a collaborative group an effective collaborative group? And I remember about 6 months ago, Antonio asked me, just a little surprised, said, is this the best collaboration you've had? And I said, yes, there's like nothing comes to even 1/10 of this. And there's something about this collaboration that resulted in it being very, very productive, in such that on the weeks that I have our monthly Zoom meeting going over the potential studies, my wife knows what days I have those meetings. She says, it looks like I'm skipping down the street to the front door because I'm just really happy. And it's something about the work we're doing together. And I think the key issues that have helped us to be having a strong collaboration, one is we have both sides have a passion for wanting to learn more about this disease. We really are committed. Number two, we have mutual respect for each other. And I think that's critical. Number three is that it's not like one group is considered the experts and another group is considered the learners. That both groups are learning from each other and are doing a better job by working with each other. And then lastly, if the three particular elements are mixed together, and then there's the passage of time, this inevitably grows into a friendship, which results in making better productivity and something that both groups feel that gives them tremendous fulfillment. So in summary, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to address you today and look forward to the opportunity tomorrow. And thank you for all your kindness and welcoming since we've been here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Berkowitz. I would like to invite you to have a seat with us. E agora, então, gostaria de convidar também o acadêmico Mauricio Magalhães, que vai fazer os comentários para tomar assento à mesa.
Boa noite a todos, excelentíssima presidente Eliette, lá, nosso secretário-geral acadêmico Omar Lupe e os queridos acadêmicos, confrades Jorge de Rezende, que juntamente com o professor Antônio Braga organizou esse magnífico simpósio, pelo menos até agora, o que nós podemos ver, and to say very welcome and thank you very much for you, those professors from Harvard and from London, for participating and to bring all your experience for us. Eu participei durante muitos anos, porque a minha formação é como ginecologista obstetra, e durante o início da minha carreira eu participei lá no Hospital do Fundão e na maternidade escola, fazendo oncologia ginecológica. Então eu tive a oportunidade de acompanhar muitos casos de neoplasia trofoblástica. Então eu acompanhei o início dessa família trofoblástica, this trophoblastic family that we have in Brazil. I have the opportunity to participate for many years, many meetings. And since from the beginning, it was a very unique group. They were very, not only working together, but they were very friendly. And they have very many opportunities. Unfortunately, we have only a few of them here, but I remember all these pictures and all of them here. Então, eu tive a oportunidade de participar de muitas dessas reuniões dessa família trofoblástica, onde o professor Fauser, o professor Paulo Belfort, o professor de Rezende, que era o grande líder de todo esse grupo, mas o professor Zé Maria Barcelos, muitos que foram citados aqui pelo professor Antônio Braga, de muita saudosa memória, e que realmente fizeram toda a diferença. E o que nós podemos ver pelo trabalho a primeira apresentação que o Braga fez, onde mostra o quanto é importante essa união. Esse grupo realmente fez toda a diferença. Nós temos hoje aqui uma nova geração deles, o pessoal aqui eu não estou vendo, mas aqui do Rio Grande do Sul, de São Paulo, que tem tido uma cooperação muito grande e que fizeram hoje quase mais de 40 centros no Brasil que trabalham de uma forma. E mais do que isso. E já há muitos anos que eu não estou envolvido na neoplasia trofoblástica, mas eu pude ver desde o início, principalmente mais recentemente, quando o professor Antônio Braga assumiu essa liderança aqui no nosso meio, pelo menos aqui no Rio de Janeiro, essa tremenda cooperação internacional. Então, by your two presentation, have seen your professor a very good review of what is the update, what's really new in the treatment and all these new perspectives, these new drugs that we have. And it's really a chapter of the oncology. It's really oncological disease. It's like I am very much involved with breast cancer. And breast cancer with pregnancy is a very difficult association. And I can imagine that it's almost the same that we have the trophoblast disease and with the women that want to have the children, their siblings, and they don't have the opportunity to, perhaps sometimes. But fortunately, there's all these treatments now. We have very good results as you have presented. And I have seen many of these integration that Antônio Braga is doing, as I know you do a very periodically meetings of the tumor board, a discussion of the case, and we can see by the quality of all these publications that we have really a very strong participation of the Brazilian community in this. And then it's what I can tell you is just to thank you for you and professor that has received Braga for this training in US and in London, and also for this opportunity to have here in the National Academy of Medicine this opportunity to present all this very nice experience and to really to stimulate all the students here to continue working as a team. This is as you have been demonstrated in one of these articles, that to work as a team make the difference. And I think that Brazil is showing that, and we can see as your presentation that even in Europe, perhaps Germany, US, not all the centers are working in a very multidisciplinary way. And we are very happy that Brazil, we are working this, and we are really making difference in this aspect. Then I really thank you and Professor Bergovitz for the presentation. Once again, congratulate Professor Braga, Jorge Rezende for this fantastic meeting, and thank you for the opportunity to present.
Muito obrigado pelos seus comentários coerentes e muito gentis, como é a sua característica, meu amigo de longa data, Mauricio Magalhães. Eu também estou aqui entre as pessoas que vão comentar, mas eu queria, em breve, relatar um pouco da nossa participação nesse lindo trabalho que o Braga veio fazendo à frente da doença trofoblástica no Rio de Janeiro e, por que não, no Brasil e no mundo. Quando a Santa Casa, que na ocasião sediava o Centro de Referência do Rio de Janeiro, começou a ter grandes dificuldades, isso coincidiu com a minha entrada na maternidade escola, já como professor titular, e viabilizamos a transferência do ambulatório lá para a maternidade escola, que longe de ser um hospital sem problemas, mas certamente permitiu que a continuidade desse ambulatório, desse serviço tão importante que vinha sendo feito desde 1960. E o Braga, com a sua capacidade, com a sua perseverança, competência e ele agrega, quer dizer, ele reúne não apenas os pares brasileiros, mas conseguiu um feito, a meu ver, inédito, uma colaboração onde, como bem disse o professor Berkowitz, não é apenas aprendiz e expert, ao contrário, são pessoas, serviços que um aprendendo com a experiência do outro. Então, é difícil se autoelogiar, mas eu me sinto muito orgulhoso de ter viabilizado hoje a atuação desse Centro de Doença Trofoblástica na nossa maternidade escola da UFRJ, que no Rio de Janeiro é um dos locais da boa prática obstétrica. Eu queria também agradecer não apenas a quem veio aqui do Brasil, mas principalmente de longe, mas agradecer à presidente, que nos deu esse voto de confiança de fazermos um modelo um pouco diferente, quer dizer, permitir sediar aqui na nossa academia, para mim, sem dúvida, o lugar mais importante da medicina brasileira, um evento dessa magnitude, reunindo grandes especialistas. Hoje, amanhã, continua o evento, e eu, então, de público, nossa presidente, agradeço o seu voto de confiança e ao nosso secretário-geral, tão ágil sempre, que viabilizou com suas trocas rápidas de WhatsApp, e viabilizou a logística dessa sessão. E ao Braga, o nosso muito obrigado, parabéns, realmente você é um homem de altíssima capacidade e que faz jus a todos esses elogios que aqui foram feitos. Então, muito obrigado mais uma vez.
Sou eu que quero agradecer a oportunidade que a Academia Nacional de Medicina teve de sediar um evento internacional e que eu acho que é o princípio da academia. A academia tem que ser um lugar aberto e que possibilite trocas entre pares, sejam pares nacionais ou internacionais. I'm just saying that it's my pleasure and I'm very thankful for the opportunity that the Academy had to host this meeting, because in my view, the Academy should be the place where physicians, academicians are able to exchange ideas with pairs, being national or international. And this is why the Academy is soon becoming 200 years old, because it is capable of providing this. And this is one of the reasons that I think people pursue to enter here. So I would like to thank all of you. Thank you very much.
Eu estava vendo a apresentação. I would deliver this speech in Portuguese and then in English, so it will be easier for everyone to follow. So, então, assim, eu fiquei muito sensibilizado de ver essa colaboração fantástica entre o UFRJ e Harvard e outras entidades internacionais, como o Imperial College of London. É raro e é difícil nós termos uma colaboração no mesmo nível. Eu tive, no meu retorno no Brasil, depois do pós-doutorado, essa oportunidade também na área de dermatologia tropical, e eu fiquei muito impactado pelo que eu vi aqui hoje. So I'd like to say to all of you, thanks for this wonderful collaboration. That's very uncommon to have this friendship and working side by side. But if I understood well, Professor Berkowitz, you have just invited Professor Braga to join the Harvard School of Medicine as an associate professor. Am I correct? So this is just wonderful news that we have just received here. So for both Professor Jorge Rezende and Antônio Braga. A big hug, and it's a wonderful news for Brazilian medicine. So wonderful news, and thank you to let us know here in public at the Academia Nacional de Medicina this wonderful invitation. Thanks.
It was frankly, we all are looking with very warm and good anticipation of Antonio joining us and we're quite hopeful that outside of the fact that we expect he'll give wonderful lectures and give us some advice about some additional studies, that it will be further strengthening the relationship with Antonio and then other centers in Brazil, as well as other types of collaboration as well. And we really want to make this a strong collaboration, because really we've only just begun. There's so much we can do. There's so much that further things that could be advanced to relieve suffering, improve the care of women, that I think that we have every reason to be hopeful and optimistic. Thank you.
Professor Seckel, would you like to?
Thank you. Well, I'd just like to echo these comments, because working together is really the best way to answer some of the very tough questions that remain to be addressed. And I've been extraordinarily impressed by what you've achieved so far, and I'm looking forward to doing much more work with you all.
Antônio, então, faça as suas considerações.
Obrigado, professor Jorge Rezende, professora Eliette Busquelá, presidente da academia. Acho que talvez um dos dias mais felizes da minha vida tá aqui com os amigos da família trofoblástica, os amigos da International Society for the Study of Trophoblastic Disease. Eu tenho alguma facilidade com as palavras, mas estou emocionado, às vezes eu fico um pouco embotado. Me lembro quando aninhei em 1999 na Santa Casa da Misericórdia do Rio de Janeiro, onde eu morei, professor Jorge Rezende sabe, eu morei dentro da Santa Casa. Durante muitos anos, eu morei dentro da Santa Casa. E a doença trofoblástica foi onde eu aprendi medicina. Quando eu tive em Boston, em Harvard, no meu primeiro pós-doutorado, no Imperial College, no meu segundo pós-doutorado, eu jamais imaginava que um novo caminho se iniciava na minha vida. Ao ser aprovado como professor da UFRJ e da Fluminense, lá pude, com o apoio do professor Jorge Rezende, fazer os serviços de doença trofoblástica. E rapidamente a gente fez uma coisa que eu considero que foi muito interessante. Todos nós aqui, que tivemos as experiências internacionais, nós fizemos o caminho de sair do sul global para ir para o norte global. E depois da minha estada nos Estados Unidos e no Reino Unido, os colegas de Boston e de Londres vieram para o Brasil. Isso foi muito singular. E eles vieram para o Brasil e passaram, Kevin, the first time you stayed with us, for 1 month, I believe. A little, something like that. Vendo pacientes conosco. No sábado, professor Eliette, nós vamos operar uma paciente. E nós vamos mostrar para os colegas dos Estados Unidos a nossa técnica de fazer essa cirurgia, porque eles não têm os materiais que nós temos aqui, eles têm outros materiais, nós vamos mostrar a técnica da cirurgia. E isso é importante porque isso se chama colaboração, onde todos aprendem com todos. num determinado momento desse ano, o professor Berkowitz apresenta a possibilidade de eu me tornar professor na Harvard Medical School. Há um processo para isso. E esse processo foi concluído com a minha aceitação como professor da Faculdade de Medicina de Harvard, onde eu terei algumas obrigações de ministrar atividades presenciais, atividades online ao longo dos semestres. E isso começa em setembro desse ano, onde eu ficarei part-time lá, part-time cá, e eu jamais imaginei que isso pudesse estar no meu radar. De modo que, às vezes, a gente sonha algumas coisas e o que Deus nos oferece, porque eu acredito em Deus, é algo muito maior do que a gente podia prever. A lição que eu tiro disso: nada substitui o trabalho. E o trabalho é a grande resposta que nós temos para quaisquer dificuldades que a vida nos impõe. Amizade, colaboração, regime para somar do tipo cresce-cresce. O outro crescendo, eu crescendo junto com ele, uma cadeia de solidariedade que fortalece a todos e faz com que nós tenhamos uma teia de colaboração verdadeira, de amizade, de respeito, e que tem como objetivo final, para além das publicações, os reconhecimentos, trazer respostas que possam melhorar a vida das pessoas. Para fazer esse trabalho todo, o professor Mauricio Viggiano disse que é preciso apenas duas coisas: gostar de estudar e gostar de gente. Parece um chavão, mas nunca foi tão essencial em medicina ter em mente como que a relação médico-paciente é importante, os valores éticos e humanísticos. Essa família trofoblástica brasileira e internacional cultiva esses valores, e esse encontro de hoje serviu para fortalecer a nossa história, a nossa memória e os nossos afetos. Queria muito agradecer ao professor Jorge, que não mediu esforço, porque assim, aqui uma digressão, eu trabalho muito, mas a mesma capacidade que eu tenho de trabalhar, eu tenho de criar problemas, porque dá muita dificuldade. Eu crio problemas, eu sei que eu crio problemas. Então, peço desculpas de público para os problemas, mas é sempre na melhor intenção de conseguir estar todos juntos, a conseguir os melhores resultados, e a gente vai tentando, errando e acertando, e o que eu quero oferecer para vocês são algumas coisas primordiais na vida. Mãos limpas e o coração puro. Professor Eliette, muito obrigado pela confiança de nos receber aqui na Casa de Soares de Meireles, nesse sodalismo sagrado da medicina brasileira, na Academia Nacional de Medicina.
Braga, de novo, sou eu que agradeço, e eu só quero te dizer o seguinte: só não erra quem não faz. Com isso, eu estou encerrando a sessão, desejando boa noite a todos e, de novo, agradecendo pela presença de vocês e pela oportunidade desta academia sediar um simpósio como esse. I would like to say good night to you and to thank you once again for the opportunity to meet all of you and to have this very nice symposium throughout the day. Thank you again and good night.